Okay, welcome everybody. This video is going to show you how to take a valve stem or a TPMS sensor that's attached to a valve stem out of your wheel without dismounting the tire and without needing a tire machine. Basically what we're going to do here is we're going to pull off the valve cap. This is how we get started here. We're going to deflate the tire. There's a number of tools you can use. There's a valve stem core tool. Basically this thing is threaded to the inside here. See if I can give you a shot of that. There's threads on the inside and on the outside. The core threads to the inside and the cap goes on the outside. So essentially that core has two flats, which I will show you. This little pocket screwdriver that I have has a core tool on the end of it. Basically it's just a round with a flat. There's a bunch of tools. These are really cheap. I recommend you getting one. But if you're in a pinch, a flathead pocket screwdriver will also work. You just got to be a little bit more careful, and I'll show you. You just get the tip on the flat inside there. You can see there's a little bit of wiggle room. It's not that tight. If this is really tight in here, you're going to be gouging your threads. You don't want to use that. You want a screwdriver that's smaller than that gap. But basically, you just got to work it in a circle, and that's already loosened. I'll tighten it up just because I don't want to use my screwdriver because I've got this tool. Tool slips over through the flats, and you unthread it. You can see the air coming out. Once you start getting it towards the end, put your fingers around it, and essentially what I'm going to do is pull this all the way out and let all the air escape and get this pressure to 0. And I'm going to leave that core out for the remainder of what I'm going to do. So I'll cut to that and be right back. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to set up your equipment here. Basically, we're using this 20-ton press from Harbor Freight. Really cheap press. These are really universal. There's a lot of tools you can add on, bend heavy metals, push ball joints, wheel studs, all kinds of stuff that you're going to need if you're working on cars. I highly recommend you get one if you got the floor space. They come in handy. In this situation, I'm using it to dismount tires, so just kind of shows you what you can use these things for. So the first step is to get your press set up. So take a tape measure, measure the height of your tire. In this case, it's about 11 inches. And I'm using a 2x6 to spread the load, which is just under 13 inches. So I need to make sure that this press has enough capacity to fit the tire and that piece of board up there, which it's about a little over 13 inches the way I have it set up. So you pull these pins at the bottom, lower your bed, get this thing to clear your tire assembly. Another thing to mention here, this press here has a pin on the bottom of it, used for putting sockets and pins and things to press. Majority of what these are used for. But in this situation, this little pin is only about 1.75 inches. If I were just to use that on this tire without using this piece of wood, that pin would just concentrate that force and wouldn't spread the load out. So basically you just keep pushing. This thing is just going to stretch and deform, and you're never going to get this bead off the wheel. So it's really important you spread the load out. Protects the tire. You don't want to do damage. You stretch a small area like that, it's going to likely cause permanent damage in the tire carcass. You don't want to do that. This situation, this thing's about maybe six inches wide. This is just a piece of scrap I had laying around. You don't need anything fancy, and that's the whole purpose of this video, just to kind of show you can get away with stuff without anything fancy if you use it in the right manner. So my setup here, once you get the bed to the right height, measure your height to the floor to this, and then just find something to support the end of the tire. In this case, I'm using 2 tires, and it worked out perfect where it's almost the same exact height as the bed of the press. Obviously, this is tires, big holes. You got metal there, and you got a nice wheel and tire combo. So I got an old piece of scrap wood here. Basically, I'm just gonna set this on top and allow a nice flat area and keep the metal from touching and marring up the wheel. You know, if something slips, something goes wrong, I don't want to destroy or you know, damage this wheel. The whole purpose of this is to save money and not end up trashing, you know, a couple $100 worth of brand new wheels. So I've got this all the way in up against these rails, and it just so happens that this press works out to where that pin is basically right in the center. Sorry about that. Right in the center of this sidewall here. So it's going to put that load in a good spot. If this pin was way to the outside towards the, I'll show you here, if that pin was pushing way towards the tread here, this whole wheel is going to want to flop out, and you're not going to be able to get enough pressure on the bead right next to this wheel to get that to dislodge. It takes a lot of force to dislodge this. That's why you actually need a press or something to really get enough pressure down on this tire to pop it off. Another thing to note here is these wheels have TPMS sensors. Basically, it's a little plastic module on the inside of this valve stem. If you were to put the valve stem right here, you know, you're thinking you need to get this out, you need to get here. Why not push down on this tire, open this up to get right here? Well, these things are really close to the bead. If you were to push down on this thing, this whole tire is deforming. You know, you're trying to stretch this over the inner lip of this bead. If you were to do that right next to this valve stem, as soon as that tire pops over that bead, there's a lot of force being pressed on this. This tire's pretty heavy duty. It's going to smack that sensor really hard and you could damage it. Most people recommend you actually press the 180 degrees away from that. Get this side dismounted, and then you can push the carcass down into the wheel with your hands and not push on this sensor. That's what you would normally do if you were going to take this tire off the wheel. But in this case, we're just trying to dismount the bead to get the sensor out, or say change your valve stem. You don't want to take the tire off if you're just trying to change this, because if you disorient everything, you're going to have to get your assembly balanced, and it's going to vibrate until you do so, because this thing's all set up and balanced as an assembly. So if instead of doing it like this, we would have to dismount this whole bead, which will make it really hard to get it mounted again at your house without a big air compressor with a lot of air. So I'm going to show you, you just want to dismount a section, get your sensor or your valve stem replaced, and then mount it back up, which we're going to do here. So last step here is, let me grab my 2x6, and we're going to set this up basically just so the inside of that wood is right next to the wheel. Now we're using wood because this is soft. If it does hit this wheel, the wood is going to, you know, deform around the wheel, and it's not really going to do much damage. This is a polished aluminum wheel. You know, if this was painted, this could chip paint, so be aware of that. If you're using a piece of steel, you may want to put a bunch of tape or something to soften that up, just to kind of keep it from marring. But in this case, wood works really good. And like I said, you want to get the pressure from this right next to the bead. That's the purpose of this wood, is to spread it out. This is a little bit of Dawn and some water, just to make a little bit of a lubricant. I like to spray it around the bead even when I'm dismounting, if I'm doing something in a press and not a proper tire machine. Sometimes you get these things pressed down really far and it's not popping off the bead. You don't want to keep going and smash this carcass, because there are some steel cords and stuff, and it could do damage if you really get too you know, carried away and start smashing this stuff down. You want to get all that pressure close to the bead, but in some situations the tire is just really stuck and kind of gripping the wheel assembly. It doesn't want to separate. So instead of just keep smashing this tire to get it off, you're going to want to let the pressure up off of the press, maybe move your piece of wood closer to the bead, and then start again. So if you were to do that and you go to release that tire, now you got a nice lubricant within that groove. So it's going to help lubricate what you're trying to get unstuck. So just a good recommendation if you're doing something like this in a press and not an actual tire machine. Tire machine usually gets it all in one because it's got a little spoon that's actually pushing on this, whereas we're just trying to press on the whole side assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and press this down now. Got this centered. We're not overhanging our lip. So I'm going to tighten up my press here and go ahead and get cranking. As I'm pushing on this, I'm going to make sure my tire is not pressing up, make sure my foundation, what this is all sitting on, is not moving around. If this starts shifting around, stop, reset, and you know, reevaluate what you got going on. This cannot move. This tire needs to stay solid. If this starts moving around, you're getting yourself into a dangerous situation. You don't want a lot of pressure holding a big inflatable object. This thing could pop out of this thing and do some damage. Always wear safety glasses. You may think this is kind of crazy. Big pieces of big things are not going to hit your eyeball. If something were to go wrong, we're putting a lot of pressure into metal and a tight assembly. Things could pop. Even if this is just water come flying out of your eye at a really fast rate. You don't want to be blind when you got something going on and you know things are going bad. If something comes out and this thing goes flying, and this is a tip for anything at home, wear safety protection. If you're in a situation where you need to act, or you just got hurt, your arms hurt, your legs hurt, or something, you don't want to also be blinded by something hitting your eyes. At least if you got safety glasses on and you do get hurt, you can find your phone, you can call help, get emergency, and get yourself fixed up. If you're blind and you're hurt, you're going to be in a bad situation. I live by myself. I do a lot of things that a lot of people think are dangerous, but you take precautions, wear the proper safety gear, and just minimize your chances of being in a bad situation that you can't really get yourself out of. So just a side note there. Anyway, we'll go ahead, we'll get pressing, and I'll show you how this works. I'll stop there. You can see the wood is just next to the wheel. It's actually not even rubbing, it's just really close. And again, I'm away from that sensor, so when that thing gets pushed down, it's not going to, hit my sensor. Okay, so we pressed it down pretty far. We've got our sidewall pushed in maybe 3-4 inches. Don't stick your fingers in there, don't do anything. This could break, this could pop at any point. Anyway, you could see here the bead is starting. You might not be able to see with the shadow, but the rubber is just on the inside of that lip. I wanted to show you because you may think, oh, I gotta, I'm damaging the tire. I can't keep pushing, something's gonna go wrong. Those of you that use tire machines, sidewalls can get pushed in pretty far. It's just the nature of what you're doing. You can hear it rolling over the top as we speak. So now it's separated. The wheel and tire are removed. So now you can unload your jack. We'll come back to that. Take your board out, you don't want to hurt anything. And basically all I'm going to do is rotate this tire and start pushing around it to try to get to where I need to go. If having it just unseated here, I can't get this thing unseated by hand, you can rotate the tire, push it over on the other side of the valve stem and try to push down here a little bit. Or you can work this way just to get that enough to work it around by hand. In this situation, you should be able to just get this popped out with some force. Okay, so as you can see, the wheel has a pretty significant lip on the inside. The bead of the tire sits between these two lips. And like I mentioned, there's steel cords in this tire on the lip of the tire where it meets the wheel. So that the bead of this tire is very stiff and encased in rubber, and that seats very, very, very tightly in this groove on the wheel. That's why it's so hard to get off, and that's why you need so much force. And that's what keeps your tire on your wheel if you ever get into, you get a flat or a nail, the tire doesn't just fall off the wheel and destroy your wheel and the bottom of your car and all kinds of other things. So just wanted to show you that a little bit more in detail. Okay, so in my situation, I'm going to be removing the TPMS sensor from this valve stem. You want to be able to get to the back of where this valve stem goes through the wheel. Right now the tire sits pretty tight against the bead, or at least the inner section of where the bead sits on the wheel. So what I'm going to do is use a couple pry bars and some small blocks of wood, and I'm going to get the pry bar under the inner lip of the wheel so that I don't do any damage to the outside wheel lip. And I'm going to press down, get the tire some clearance, and then wedge that piece of wood in there. I'm going to put 2 pieces of wood basically on both sides of my valve stem so that I get some room to work and get my hands in there. I'm going to set this down and I'll show you that real quick. Okay, so I've got my pry bar and my blocks of wood. I'm going to get it down in here. Sometimes there's little flats inside the lip. A good spot to put it is on the flat. And then another thing to remember, some of these TPMS sensors sit out away from this lip. So as you're going down with the bead, it's a good idea to pull it around the actual sensor. It wants to push that sensor down into the wheel. You need to pry the tire away from that sensor to clear it as you're doing this. So hopefully that's clear on video. So now that I've got a gap, I'll take my piece of wood in there. Kind of get it so the wood is nice and square. It's not on an angle, it's not tilted. This is in there pretty good. So I'll do the same to the other side. Make sure that sensor is clear before I push this down too far. And like so, we'll get this in here. Just like that. So now I've got enough room to be able to see the sensor and the bottom of the valve stem. If you don't have a TPMS system on your car, this valve stem basically stops where this rubber is. And a very quick way to get this out is just to take a razor blade and cut that rubber, and then this will pop right out. Make sure you grab that piece of rubber so it don't fall on the tire, because you don't want that bouncing around. Let's pry it down. I'm gonna bring these to the next step to get this pushed down even further so that I can get to this screw. The screw basically faces straight down, and right now I don't have enough room to get that screw out with this tire right here. If you just had a valve stem without a TPMS, like I said, this would be plenty of room. You would cut that, pull both pieces, take this out, get your new valve stem under there, pull it through, and then get it popped through the hole of the wheel. In this situation, I'm gonna move these down here, give myself a little bit more room. I'll show you that here. Okay, so now you can see I've got quite a lot more clearance. Both these pieces of wood, you know, they can pop out, but you want those on both lips of the wheel and flat against this. Same with this, you know, if this was tilted like that, do not stick your fingers in there. There's a good chance this piece of wood is gonna pop out. Square everything up, make sure it's nice and tight. Make sure this thing is not moving anywhere before you start working on this thing. Okay, so now I need to remove the screw from the sensor. First thing I'm gonna do is not lose that screw or that sensor into this wheel. That would be a tragedy, and I would be taking this completely off of the wheel, and I would need to balance the assembly, and just be a headache. So don't drop anything inside the wheel if you're doing something like this. Take my old rag here. I like to roll it, so that way if anything falls in the rag, it doesn't go into the wheel. It kind of goes into this little pocket. So roll it maybe a couple of times, and get it stuffed down into that opening you've created, basically as a catch-all, so that if anything falls, it's going to fall into the rag and not into the wheel. I don't have a good way to hold this camera as I'm taking this out, so I'll try to get it as best I can. But basically, the tools I've got is a small 1/4 inch open-end wrench, and in this case, this sensor has a T10 Torx. I don't know if you can see that, but it's a T10 Torx bit. So basically I'm going to stick this bit like that vertically, and right now actually the tire's holding it nice and straight. So I'm going to support it with both hands. I won't be able to do it on video that well, get a close-up, but I'm going to hold the bit, I'm going to get this wrench around it, and I'm going to just keep rotating that bit with the wrench and holding it with my fingers. I'm going to work that all the way out until I can get it with my fingers and pull that sensor out. I wish I had a better way to videotape this a little closer, but I don't, so bear with me here. So right now I've got my bit inserted into my sensor. My wheel's kind of holding it steady. If I just started turning it, that bit's going to cock to the side and it's going to strip my screw out, and then I'm not going to be able to continue doing what I'm doing without taking the tire off. So I'm going to keep my fingers in here, support the bit. I'm going to take my wrench and just turn that bit and loosen that screw little by little. Make sure lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, don't go the wrong way. This is brass, these are small screws. They can't strip out. Okay, so I've got my screw unthreaded, I believe. I'm gonna pull my bit out there. Get this bit out, make sure you don't drop it. And then I'm going to grab both the screw and the sensor, and it just slides straight down off of the valve stem. Pulled it out with my fingers. So here's the actual sensor. There's the T10 torque screw, and there's I don't have good lighting, but there's 2 flats and a hole. And the way that these stems work is it's a round brass end, threads on the center for the screw, and there's 2 flats on it. So this thing essentially just pops up over those flats, and then the screw holds it to it. There's a bunch of different styles of these, but a lot of them are attached this way. So if you're having issues, you don't necessarily need to go spend a ton of money, pay a tire shop, and go through all that. These things are pretty cheap online. You maybe even be able to buy some knockoff brands. You know, if it's easy for you to change these at home, you can maybe get a little $10 one instead of paying $100 from the OEM. So hopefully this helps you and save a little money. Here's the bottom of the valve stem. For tires that have TPMS sensors and you're having TPMS issues and you just bought the wheels, maybe that, you know, the sensor's missing or the sensor could be bad. There's a battery in here. These only last maybe, you know, average of 4 to 6 to 8 years, depending on how much you drive it, how often you drive it, all that kind of stuff. But like anything, you get more or less depending on all kinds of factors. Anyway, this is hopefully a quick way for you to get these in and out. You do want to torque this. There's a torque setting for this screw. For anybody that has sense of mechanical knowledge and works on some stuff and you get a feel for torque, 10 foot-pounds is all, or 10 inch-pounds I think it is. So it's not very tight. A little 1/4 inch combination wrench that I was using. Basically snug with that is about 10 inch-pounds. You know, it's not super science. This is brass. It's just gonna strip the brass out. So just snug it until you feel it stop, and that's good. Okay, so now that you've got maybe your sensor out, or say you put your new sensor in, or you changed your valve stem, whatever you're needing to do, you got the job done, pull your rag out. You're gonna want to take your pry bar and remove your boards, or your pieces of wood, or whatever you have under here to hold the space open while you're working. Like so, like so. And as when we pulled it apart, like I mentioned, there's not a lot of clearance in here. As you can see, I left the sensor out, but as I release this tire, it may be sitting on the sensor or resting. If that's the case, put your pry bar in like so and pop it around the sensor. You don't want this pushing on the sensor itself. You want the sensor on the inside and this to be over the top of it. And then I'll show you how to get your bead started and inflated, get your core in there, fill it back up, and you'll be on your way. Now, some of you may be thinking, I just removed the valve stem, or I'm sorry, a TPMS sensor off of the valve stem. It could throw off the balance of this tire assembly. The owner of these tires, or the new owner of these tires, is going to be installing his TPMS sensors, which are really close to the same weight, so won't likely need to rebalance this. If you were changing the sensor due to a bad battery and you're putting the same sensor back in it, you should not need to rebalance anything. You didn't disorient the tire from the wheel assembly. They're still in their same orientation, and you replace the item that weighs the same, so you should not need to rebalance this. Fill it up with air, put it on your car, and call it a day. So we're going to fill this thing up. You're going to need as much air velocity as possible, so leave the core out like we did when we drained it. You're going to want to fill this air. If there's a gap under here, sometimes you need to press on the tire tread to close that gap as you're filling with air. Just so you see, I am using a cheap little tiny air compressor. You do not need anything fancy. You don't need a huge, massive shop air. These Eastwood air fillers, here's the part number. 30535 is the part number for this. This is a great digital air chuck. It has good velocity, like it's not very restrictive, so it fills quick. Leave the core out, fill it up, get the bead seated. There are notes on these tires that say how much pressure to not exceed as you're doing this. If you start filling it up and it's not popping over, release the air and start over. Use your lube, get that bead nice and lubricated. This is rubber on metal, it's grippy. It's a tire, it's meant to grip. You don't want that grip, and you want to slide over and seat into the bead. So make sure you got some lube in there, make sure your gauge is on, set to 0 so you can monitor this as you go, and fill it up. See, all the air is leaking? So I'm going to want to push up on this, and the air compressor is going to start on in a second, but you'll kind of see what I'm doing, just closing that gap as I'm filling. And now it's filling. See the tire rising? Okay, so one thing to note here is I just got it filled up. I put a bunch of air in here. You don't really need to have a lot of air. It's actually good to not fill it up too far. My camera died. I didn't realize it, so I'm showing you now that I filled the air up. Essentially, as soon as you pop the bead, you can remove your air chuck and get your valve core back in there. At that point, you can just fill it as you normally would. So I'm going to basically pull this off, use my valve stem tool, get this on there, and thread it as the air's rushing out. This thing's pretty pointed, so just use some little bit of physics. Keep this thing vertical as you approach the valve, get it inserted in the hole, and start the threads. If you come in sideways, this thing's going to want to, get pushed out of the way with the air, and it could go flying across the shop. It's really small. You might lose it if you don't have an extra. So just a tip, keep it vertical, keep it on your tool, insert it together, and it goes really quick and easy. So I'll show you that. Pop it off, put it in. And easy as that, tighten it. These things have a rubber seal. Just snug it with your fingers, not too tight, just snug. It's not leaking air. If it does leak, you just snug it up, no big deal. At this point, you're going to want to fill it back up to your desired pressure, put the cap on, put it back on the car, and call it a day. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helps you, and appreciate your views. Have a good one.